Here's the reading of pages 533 to 538, and we are on part 4, chapter 7 of Land and Loyalty. And always check out the pictures. So by the 10th century, Charlemagne's empire was no more. The Vikings were raiding coastlines. Central government had broken down in what is now France, Germany, and Italy. Armed bands roamed the countryside. Who or what could provide safety and order in this dangerous time? Some kings still reigned in Europe in the early 11th century, but they weren't all powerful rulers, even in their own realms. Instead, individual noblemen grew stronger. All over Europe, princes, barons, dukes, and counts ruled regions they had gained by combat or inheritance. These powerful landowners, called lords, often acted as if each ruled its own little kingdom. While a king ruled over a lord, a great lord might own more land than the king and command a larger army. The lord of a region used his land to gain the loyalty of the people around him. He did that by granting tracts of land to lesser nobles or knights. A grant of land was called a fief. A noble or knight who received a fief became the lord's vassal. A vassal as a vassal, he owed the lord certain obligations, including loyalty and the promise of military service. He swore to fight for the lord if needed. In return, he owned the fief and profited from farming the land. This arrangement, in which a lord granted land and protection to a vassal in return for loyalty and military service, later became known as feudalism. The term comes from the French word feudaliser, which means loyalty. Kings, nobles, kings and nobles and knights throughout much of medieval Europe pledged their loyalty and recognized their duties to each other under the feudal system. When a knight or noble swore loyalty to a lord and became his vassal, he took part in a ceremony known as a homage. Let's drop by the great hall of a lord's home for a moment. A ceremony of homage is about to begin. Paying homage. The knight has just arrived, looking pleased with himself, but also a little nervous. The Lord's great hall is more crowded than he expected, for many members of the Lord's household have gathered to witness the event. Three classes of medieval societies are here, groups whose names rhyme nicely in Latin: the orate, the bellator, and the laborator. So the orate, bellator, laborator. The orator are those who pray, the clergy. We'll learn more about them in the next chapter. The bellator are those who fight, the knights. The laborator do some praying and fighting too, but they're mostly known for something else. They're the ones who do the work, especially the work of providing food. Most people in the Middle Ages worked the land. All eyes are now on the knight, who approaches the man who will be his lord. Silence falls as the knight bends to his knees. The lord gazes at him sternly. "Do you wish without reservation to become my man?" the lord asks. "I wish it," the knight replies. The lord encloses the new vassal's hands in his and seals the agreement with a ceremonial kiss. At this, a priest steps forward bearing a casket containing sacred relics of a saint, the bones or other remains of a holy person. Upon these holy objects the vassal swears his oath. "I promise from this time forward to be faithful to my lord," he says, "and I will maintain toward him my homage." The lord nods and the homage ceremony comes to an end. The two men now share a bond. The lord has added one more to his army of knights. The vassal leaves satisfied as well. He's thinking of the fief he'll hold as long as he remains loyal to his lord. A broad tract of land alongside a stream. He's had his eye on it for quite some time, and now he is its lord. The feudal system was like a chain of interlocking loyalties that held the top levels of the medieval society together. Barons with much land granted fiefs to nobles, who in return pledged their loyalty and service. Those nobles in turn might divide their lands among lesser lords and knights, who become their vassals. And those lesser lords, if they had enough land, might have vassals of their own. By exchanging land, service, and protection, the nobility gained some security and order in uncertain times. What about those who worked? The peasants and landless laborers? They made up most of the population. They were put on a system that exchanged protection for labor. They offered their work, farming or smithing, for example, and sometimes even their freedom for permission to farm land on the lord's estate. The lord in turn offered the invaluable protection of his knights. Okay, so a little Latin. If you know a little Latin, then you can figure out the rules of each of the three classes of medieval society: the orator, the bellator, and the laborator. The suffix tor is added to a word to show one who does. In Latin, ora is the verb for pray, ask, beseech. Bella means fight, and labora means work or toil, from which, as you can see, we get our English word labor. All right, those who fight, the knights. Of the three social classes in medieval times, you have probably heard most about the bellator, the knights. A lord often had his own army of knights on horseback, and these vassals defended the lord and his territory against raiders. Since ancient times, mounted soldiers had fought in battle, but before the Middle Ages, the soldiers on horseback often wasn't an effective fighter. He lacked two very important inventions: stirrups and horseshoes. Barbarians from Central Asia, called the Huns, were the first to bring stirrups to Western Europe. Once a soldier had stirrups attached to his horse's saddle, his feet were held in place and he could sit firmly on the horse's back. This allowed him to charge against a strong line of foot soldiers, scattering them much as a bowling ball knocks down a pins. Without stirrups, a soldier on horseback couldn't make this kind of charge. As soon as he bumped into the line and made contact with the foot soldiers, the horseman often ended up on the ground. It was then short work for the foot soldiers to finish him off. Let's come back here and let's this. So medieval justice. Under the feudal system, lords promised justice to their vassals. Quarrels between vassals were settled at the lord's court, where the lord himself presided. A vassal accused of wrongdoing often received judgment from his peers, that is, his social equals. The modern-day idea of a trial by jury of one's peers comes from this feudal custom. Many medieval notions of justice couldn't strike us as very just. Vassals sometimes settled dispute with trial by combat, even to death. The belief was that God defends the just men. Another way to determine guilt was trial by ordeal. For example, by making the accused person walk over hot coals. If the person's injuries healed within 3 days, it was taken as a sign of innocence. Punishments in the Middle Ages could be harsh. A guilty person might be dragged behind a horse and beaten with rods. Others, however, punishment involved paying a fine to a lord or a king. Okay, so after the stirrup came the horseshoe, iron shoes nailed to a horse's hooves. They helped the horse keep its footing on soft, wet ground and gallop over hard, dry terrain. A shoed horse could carry a heavy load without damaging its hooves, and few loads were heavier than a medieval knight. Each knight in armor wore a padded undergarment to protect him from his blows. Over this undergarment he donned a tunic of iron links or chain mail. Chain mail hoods, mitts, and leggings shielded his neck, arms, and legs, while a steel helmet covered his head. In time, knights figured out ways to protect themselves more fully by adding pieces of plate armor over the mail. Eventually, a full suit of plate armor replaced mail. Clad in armor and mounted on his war horse, the knight was a daunting sight to foot soldiers. Their spears and arrows could seldom pierce his armor, and blows from their swords or clubs rarely toppled him from his horse. This left the desperate foot soldiers with two options. They could try to get close enough during the battle to cut the saddle from the knight's horse, or they could try to kill the knight's horse, unless it too was wearing armor. A knight in armor knew how to use several deadly weapons. The most important was his lance, a long, heavy spear. In battle, knights would form a line, point their lances forward, and then, like a thundering wall of iron, rush toward their enemies. For close-in fighting, the knight could try to smash an enemy's armor with a battle axe or a ball and chain. To finish the enemy off, he could use two-handed sword or a sharp dagger to thrust between gaps in armor. Fighting on horseback required elaborate equipment and intense training. Because both were expensive, few young men could afford to become knights. By the 1100s, knights were practicing their skills in mock battles called tournaments. Lance in hand, knights galloped toward each other, each seeking to knock the other from his saddle or piece of his armor. Over time, these tournaments became social events with more pageantry and less bloodshed. At first, however, the tournaments were massive contests with deadly results. In early tournaments, hundreds of knights divided into two sides, then clashed head-on in the countryside over several days. These first tournaments were so bloody that they called for them to end. The church opposed them, so did many nobles and kings, who did not like the idea of all those armed men gathering in a single place, ready for combat and maybe rebellion. Later, tournaments limited combat to two knights at a time. All right, the last little bit here, the code of chivalry. In the Middle Ages, knights often fought among themselves for land and booty. The peasants suffered the most from these skirmishes. Warring knights trampled their fields, drove off their livestock, and killed anyone who got in their way. The Christian Church tried many times to curb this lawlessness. Gradually, priests and bishops persuaded knights throughout Europe to adopt rules of honorable conduct known as chivalry. The code of chivalry spelled out virtues knights should follow. A good knight, said the code, was loyal to God, the church, and the Lord he served. He fought bravely and could bear great suffering. Yet he was also expected to protect the weak, the poor, the helpless, and all women and children. The code of chivalry called upon the knight to be generous to all and merciful to his enemies. A good knight was to be fair, just, kind, and trustful, and never break a promise. He never shrank from his duty, even if it meant giving up his life. The code of chivalry described an ideal knight, charitable, kind, and loyal. It set high standards that few knights actually met. Despite the code, many knights raided and plundered when they could get away with it. While knights often acted with honor toward their lords and peers, they could be brutal toward the poor. Still, the code of chivalry set standards for those who might try to live by them. Those century-old rules have helped shape our ideas of good conduct today. All right, and that's the reading for 533 to 538.